said if you want a good story, just ask any random person if there was ever an event in their life they cannot explain. Someone almost always has one weird thing that has happened to them. So Reddit, regardless of whatever you believe about the world, what's your story? Not me, my father. From his perspective. When I was young, probably 12 or 13, my family lived in a small residential suburb. There was a street lamp right across the street from us that would shine into our living room window at night, so every night before we went to bed my father would draw the curtains. One night I woke up around 2 a.m. and went to the kitchen to get some water. As I passed through the living room I noticed a beam of light from the street lamp had made it through a small gap between the curtains and I had the urge to peek through. Standing under the street lamp was a tall man with a black cap, silver skin, and massive eyes, those huge bug eyes that you see in alien movies. He was standing there motionless, and staring right at me. I quickly ducked down behind my father's recliner. There was no way he could have seen me, the house was completely dark and I barely moved the curtains as I looked through. After a few minutes of sitting on the floor behind the recliner, I grew curious to see if the man had passed. I looked through the curtains again. Pressed firmly against the other side of the glass, inches away from my face, was the silver man with bug eyes, staring right at me. After a moment frozen in terror, I ran through the house towards my father's room and woke him up, quickly telling him what happened. He grabbed his shotgun and went outside to look around. He didn't find anyone, but there was a set of fresh footprints in the dew that had been collecting on the lawn. My father has recounted this story to me exactly twice, and even though it happened to him some 40 years ago, I could still see the goosebumps on his arms as he recalled the experience. This is a dark one. It happened when I was around 11, my parents and I went on a trip to Austria and we visited a theme park. In the theme park was a jumpy thing. There were a 1 meter, 2 meters, and 3 meters pole and you could jump down on this huge cushion. I wanted to try and went straight up the highest pole. I've jumped down those poles before a few times, but that time I was just terrified. I don't know why, but all out of a sudden I was shaking and scared for my life. It was this deep kind of fear which I never felt before. My mind was telling me not to jump. Which didn't make sense because I just jumped down there and it was fun. So I let the kid behind me go first. She died. The cushion had a leak and she broke her neck. She was 9 years old. I climbed down and will never forget this. If I had jumped, I would be dead and I can't stop feeling like fate wanted me on that day and not her. Me and a friend saw a teeny tiny person. This was in the 90s and there was a really nice pub about a mile from where my friend Jason lived and the walk there from his house took us along one of the canals. This was in England, the West Midlands to be precise. One evening, I'd gone over to his house, we'd walked over to the pub, had a couple of pints, something to eat, and were on our way back. It wasn't late, early evening and still a decent amount of light. We're walking down the track beside the canal when we hear a splash in the water behind us. Turning around, we see, about 40 feet away, the ripples of something moving through the canal towards the bank. Now both of us were keen birdwatchers at the time so we were guessing it was something like a coot or a moorhen. So we were both pretty fucking shocked when what looked like a tiny little naked ass man, about 8 inches tall, climbed out of the water, shook himself off and dashed into the hedgerow. We were both frozen for a few moments before we headed to the spot where the little man had gotten out of the water. Didn't find any trace of him. We got back to Jason's place and spent a couple of hours trying to rationalize it, but there was no other animal or bird that we could think of that we might mistake for a tiny person. I was homesick sometime during HS, 11th, or 12th grade. I was sitting in my computer chair playing Skyrim when my dog, who was usually contempt by himself and never one for affection, came into my room and lay down staring out my door. Me being alone and this not being his normal course of action, unnerved me a bit, so I closed my door and went back to playing. Not 3 minutes later I hear the voice of my mother calling my name, clear as day. She's a school teacher, so she would have been at work. Shitting myself, I try to be as quiet as possible and lower my TV all the way down to make sure I didn't attract whatever I heard and could hear more clearly, only to hear the bedroom door upstairs slam shut. Sat in my room and noped all day long in silence until my mom came home. I asked her if she was home earlier and denied it. One of the scariest moments of my life. When I was growing up, my dad and I would sit for hours and watch dragonflies. He and my mom divorced when I was 13 and he moved out of state and couldn't really support himself and a kid, so my mom got custody and moved us to a different state. The invitation was always open for him to visit but he never did, but we'd talk on the phone a few times a week to stay caught up. He'd gotten a rare kind of cancer in his vocal cords and was going to have something surgically removed in there. He called me a few days after the surgery and told me things were looking good, but they were keeping him in the hospital because he had a fever after the surgery. I knew at that point that this was our last conversation. The next day, I was sitting in my truck before work with the window open and a dragonfly landed on my hand. It was November, so there shouldn't have been any around, and it felt like my dad was standing there. About 2 minutes later I got a call from his friend that was staying with him at the hospital that he had passed away about 5 minutes before I'd seen the dragonfly. Weirdest thing I can think of is this. When I was a freshman in high school, I started getting really into like psychics and stuff, and my friend, now my so, took me to this palm reading / tarot card booth at a Renaissance fair. When I sat down in front of her, she greeted me, then looked behind me, then back at me, and said, "You have 4 people behind you." I went into her tent alone. I don't remember much of the reading, just that she mentioned African violets, because one of the spirits behind me had some connection to them. I didn't really think much of it because I didn't know anybody, dead or alive, who liked African violets, and I forgot about it until the following year. The next year, I went to the same booth, with a different lady. Mine so sat with me. She asked me if I knew anything about African violets, completely unprovoked. I said no. She said I should get them, for the spirit behind me. I left the reading feeling really weird, but again I kind of shrugged it off. 6 months later, I was at a Home Depot with my dad. I separated from my dad to look at the flowers and came across some African violets. I bought them, put them in a new pot, and set them on my windowsill when I got home. 2 minutes later, my mom comes in and asks me if I got anything from the store. African violets, I told her. My mom smiled and sighed, then looked at me and said, "You know, those were your grandmother's favorite flowers." My grandmother died 9 years ago, when I was 11. And when I went back to that booth the following year, they didn't even mention African violets. I know it's not a creepy story or anything, but it still kinda weirds me out. When I was young, 6 to 8, not really sure, my parents had this apartment building they rent out near our house, and one of the tenants was a couple. The wife's parents were also our neighbors and they lived a block away from us. I used to play with the wife's younger brother and would hang out at the couple's apartment to play. It was around the couple's son's birthday and I think it was his first because I remember they were making a big deal about it and talking about it for weeks. They were gonna hold it at the wife's parents' house, which wasn't that far from home, so I asked my parents if I could go. I remember them indirectly saying no, and I guess in a joking / teasing kind of way told me they were gonna serve ducks instead of chicken. I hated ducks as a kid. I remember clearly being really bummed out about it for days. A few days after the party, I was hanging out at the apartment and they were gushing about the party pictures that just got developed, film ones, and I was like, I wish I was there. Then the wife was like, "What do you mean? You were? Look, here you are." And showed me the pictures and I was there. I'm sure I'm not remembering it wrong because it has been bothering me all this time. I remember asking my aunt if I went and she even said no, but my friend, the younger brother, told me I was there and we even played. I just don't remember attending that party at all. I actually asked my aunt about this recently and she doesn't remember. It was just weird. This happened over 5 years ago now. My sister, 9 at the time, and I, 14 at the time, shared a room, with our beds next to each other. Normally our beds were 4 feet apart, but they ended up being directly next to each other one night, probably because at the time, she was constantly doing gymnastics on her bed which would push the mattress. That night, I dreamt of a glass doll with long, dark hair. I remember feeling like I needed to protect it. I tried my best to keep it safe, promising it would be okay. But as I said these words, the doll's hair began falling out. I dropped the doll and it shattered. With the help of doctors, the doll was glued back together, and her hair grew back. When I woke up, I felt like crying. I didn't understand why I had that dream. I noticed my head had left my pillow at some point, and it was against my sister's head. When she finally woke up, she told me about her dream. It was the same. By this point, I was totally freaked out, but she didn't believe me when I told her. I guess she thought I was messing with her. 6 months later, my sister was diagnosed with cancer. She ended up losing all her hair. And like the dream, her hair grew back and she got better. She doesn't remember this happening, and I'm still just confused about it all. In a way, I'm thankful for the dream because I got to somewhat emotionally brace myself for what was to come. I don't really tell anyone about it because it doesn't seem real and I'm pretty sure I'd sound crazy, lol. Anyway, thanks for reading. If you did, I have more that I might post about later. TL, Dr. Me and my little sister shared a dream that predicted her cancer diagnosis. I had an accident when I fell asleep driving. I went off the road when I reached a T, headed straight into a wooded area going about 50 miles per hour, but ran into a telephone pole's guy wire, heavy cable driven into the ground at a 45-degree angle to the pole. Well, that cable was a godsend because it absorbed most of my kinetic energy and significantly slowed me down. To give you an idea of how much energy it absorbed, it cut into the front end of my car about 2, slicing the battery in half in the process. It also pivoted me around 90 degrees so I was sideways when I went down a hill into the woods. Rolled the car about 3 times and ended up on the roof. I completely missed all of the trees. I extracted myself from the crash, gathered my stuff, and walked away from the accident completely unharmed, was wearing my seatbelt. I walked home, which was about 2 miles, it was 2 a.m. and pre-cell phones. After I got home I noticed about midway on my right thigh, a perfect 1 square of fabric was gone from my khaki pants. I'm talking about a perfect square. The edges were so clean, like it was carefully carved out with a scalpel. No cuts or scrapes on the skin of my thigh. It was surreal and creeped me out. I believe that after I die, I will be presented with this one piece of khaki fabric and be told, it wasn't your time. When I went back to the scene the next day, the telephone pole guy wire had snapped, and the pole, while still standing, had been pulled so hard that where it went into the ground, the hole was elongated about 6 before it sprung back. No sign of the square of fabric. I'm gonna make this as short as possible, but I was supposed to be flying out to Thailand from Australia. I was also kind of seeing this guy who was flying into Melbourne the same day I was leaving. He asked if I wanted to visit him and spend Christmas with him, but I was pretty set on going to Thailand for Christmas. The night before I was supposed to leave I had the worst dream. I was standing on the beach and these huge waves just started coming for me. Ended up swallowing me and taking me away. I woke up in the worst sweat ever. Completely freaked me out. Never, ever had such a vivid dream. I can't even explain how real it felt. Anyway, I spoke to the guy the next morning and impulsively changed my ticket to go see him in Melbourne instead. The dream just gave me the creeps that bad. Turns out the Boxing Day tsunami hit right where I would have been staying. Probably a weird coincidence, but makes me think. Oh, and I'm married to that guy now. This isn't mine, but my grandma's and my mum's. I was a child, I'm guessing 5 or 6. We were on holiday in a coastal town in England and had gone to the beach. It was summer, but this is the UK, so it was one of those days that was warm enough to sit on the beach for a bit but not really warm enough to do the whole go in the sea, sunbathing thing, so they were sat up watching me play in the sand and I set my mind to building a super big sandcastle. Being a kid, it was soon decided that I needed a moat for the castle. Cue me going backwards and forwards to the sea to get water and becoming gradually annoyed/perplexed that the water just kept soaking in. The beach wasn't busy, there were other family groups there, some singular sunbathers but reasonably spaced out. Anyway, my grandma and my mum saw this one chap walk into the beach and immediately got vibes from him. They didn't know why. I mean, yeah, the guy was on his own, but that doesn't immediately make someone questionable. There were lots of lone swimmers doing their daily exercise, for example. But no, there was something unsettling about him, despite him looking distinctly average, late 30s/early 40s, brown hair, light-skinned, of average weight and height. The only thing my grandma really picked up on was his piercing eyes, whatever that means. Still, they had a feeling they couldn't explain. The man placed himself 6 meters or so away from me as I was pottering in the sand, and my mum and grandma carried on chatting, but something in them told them to not take their eyes from this chap who was sat on the sand picking up sand and letting it run through his fingers. After a while, he too started making a castle. At that point, something freaked my mum out enough to call me over and say we were leaving to do something else now. I was cross. I was very happy making my beautiful castle. The thing my mum couldn't shake was the feeling that the guy was trying to attract my attention by doing childlike activities. But she had nothing to go on and felt as though she was being paranoid. Anyway, the rest of our coastal holiday went by without issue. We didn't see him again. That is, until a week or 2 later when he'd been arrested. This guy's face was in the paper and on the news for abducting a young girl, the same age as me. I've tried to Google it. This would have been early to mid-90s, and I can't find coverage, so I'm guessing the child was returned safely. I'll have to ask my grandma and see if she remembers exactly where it was, as I don't, and my mum passed away a year or so after this happened, so I can ask her. If I find an article I'll update.